Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Caroline von der Mosel, and I'm genuinely excited to be delivering one of the final keynotes of what's been a truly inspiring day today. And as you might have guessed from the title, this session is all about labels and more specifically about unlabeling HR. And unlabeling, well, that's quite a big and probably a very new buzzword for most of you. And together in this keynote, we will be exploring its meaning and its importance. So, first of all, who am I to talk about labels, especially labels in the workplace? Well, I carry quite a few labels, and the ones where most of my time, energy, and passion go are listed here. So, they're also the ones that have shaped or triggered in one or the other way the learnings that I will be sharing today. So my first label, I'm a proud mom of an 8 and a 3-year-old, and societal expectations that come with the label of being a mom. So essentially, what you should or shouldn't be doing when being a mom have had me thinking about labels, and they're often very, very reactive character for the last 8 years now. My second label, people development. So I've worked in HR, specializing in people development for over a decade, and essentially both through my own experience and also observing HR practices more broadly, I've seen firsthand the self-fulfilling and not always super positive effects of labels in the workplace, which essentially is inspired me to create the third label that you can see on the screen here, which is that I'm an author. So I have written the book Untagged, The Power of Removing Labels in the Workplace. It's a book that challenges the use of traditional labels in the workplace and explores new ways of leading and also of practicing HR. So, my goal for you today is to spark a few thought provoking moments and maybe even inspire some small shifts in how you lead and approach HR practices within your organization. So as you can see from that introduction, labels are super, super powerful. They express our identity, our achievement, and what's important to us in a very short amount of time. So if labels are so powerful, why would we want to question or even remove them? And in order to answer that question, I would like to suggest a very quick detour to see how we apply labels in people generally. So I guess anyone who's done an unconscious bias training will be probably very familiar with the following. We apply labels to people all the time without being consciously aware of it. So whether that is people we see on the street, people we meet and interact with for the first time, or people we interview. Why do we need label? Well, because reality is too complex for us to grasp, especially considering that, and you might have heard that if you've done an unconscious bias training, the brain takes in 11 million pieces of information per second, and we're only consciously aware of 40 of them. So, like, it's 11 million versus 40, 40. So, essentially, meaning that we really, really rely on labels to reduce cognitive load. How we do that? How do we label? Well, we scan people for specific physical aspects like their appearance, for example, skin color, look, or clothing, and then we look for stored past information we have on people with similar attributes to make a very quick judgment call. So, do I like that person? Can I trust that person? Lastly, if we need to be very quick with the judgment call, for example, if we feel threatened by someone on the street, we reduce time to decide and act quickly, often by avoiding interaction and making the decision one directional. So keep that in mind for later. We will be coming back to that. Be reminded that unconscious labels are one, based on shortcuts, two, based on the past, and three, one directional. What about labels in the workplace? That is why we're here. Um, And essentially, what do I mean when I speak about labels in the workplace? Uh, Even if you work in HR, you might not have realized that essentially all of our HR practices are very dependent on labels in one or another way. So let me give you some examples. We apply performance and potential ratings to capture how someone is doing or might be doing in the future. We apply hierarchical labels as, for example, seniority, job levels, or job titles to determine their level of decision making, reward, and authority. We use demographic labels such as generational labels, the boomers, Gen Z, Gen Y, to express the age group they belong to. And if you, like me, work in the production environment, you will be very used to hearing the label of blue and white collar to determine the environment someone works in. And finally, psychological labels, that we place people in psychological boxes, telling them to which degree they're introvert, extrovert, blue, red, or which four letters determine who they are. So quite a lot of labels we depend on to making HR happen, right? So how do we then label in the workplace? How do we use labels in HR? Before giving you the answer to that, I would like us to explore the following case study together. So I'd like you to imagine the scenario that I will be reading out to you now very vividly and listening to it deeply, because it's important to really pay attention to the details. And chances are it won't be too hard, because I think many of us have seen something like that play out at work. I have at least a lot of times in my career. So here's the setup. Sarah is a manager. You can see her on the right here. And imagine she's getting a new team member, Jake, on the left here. He's being transferred from another department into Sarah's team. Neither of them really asked for it, it just kind of happened. So imagine through an acquisition or a restructuring of teams. Now, before Jake even sets a foot in her team, Sarah takes a look at his previous performance reviews in the system. And they're not great. Not terrible, but definitely not so good. So naturally, she starts forming an opinion. She assumes Jake might not be a great fit and lowers her expectations. So what happens? Sarah, already expecting the bare minimum, doesn't give Jake much feedback or meaningful opportunities. She doesn't invest in his growth, and Jake, feeling that lack of trust and support, starts to check out a bit. He starts to become really disengaged. A few months in, Jake submits an important project, and it's so so, nothing special. And for Sarah, that's it, confirmation. See, I knew he wasn't going to be a strong performer right from the start. So, what happened here? Well, this example clearly shows us that the label giver, Sarah, in that example, uses exactly the same characteristics to label that we've seen in the unconscious example in the beginning of the presentation. So she's also using a shortcut, a label in the form of a grade or a rating, that she's looking out for confirmation if that's true. Second, she's outcome and path based. So she's looking at the poor end result in hindsight without considering learnings or progress that might have happened on the way. And finally, she's being one directional, essentially not seeing her responsibility in creating the whole scenario and just blaming Jake for the outcome. So what does it tell us? So in summary, even if labeling is a very conscious choice in HR, so in that example, the conscious choice to put performance ratings on someone as a strategy, the disadvantages and biases we're seeing in that specific example, are very similar to what we saw in the beginning. So the disadvantages in an unconscious setting, we're replicating the past, and that is something that we can also see here. Sarah is replicating the past to a certain degree, inviting Jake in a certain way to replicate the same underperforming behaviors. Let's look at it a little bit closer just to understand what really happened. Well, you will see that the labels were applied exactly in the same manner as we did in the unconscious way, but there's much broader effects to it, much broader and somehow damaging effects to it. So let me highlight the things about labels that we often overlook in the workplace, because it's relatively easy to label people, but then the effects of it might be much broader and very negative. So first, Sarah acts in a one-directional labeling mode, placing the whole responsibility on Jake. But what is really happening is that she, by not seeing him, not listening to him, or not coaching him, takes part in creating the scenario. So what we often overlook when it comes to labels in the workplace is that it's essentially the label giver, but also the label receiver who shape and create reality. Second, Sarah reacts on a performance label that is based on the past. But in reality, what she's actively creating and is poor conditions for the future. So what we often overlook when it comes to labels in the workplace is that we influence the future of someone with the labels we place on them, even if they're past-based, for the better or for the worse. And then lastly, Sarah takes the shortcut of the label of a low or underperformer as a way to treat Jack less respectfully. So what we often overlook when we apply labels in the workplace is the fact that labels are very easy to give. It's just a click away, but they are very hard to remove, especially also when they're set in stone in an HR system, as was the case in that example. So what we see here very, very clearly is the negative and also to some degree self-fulfilling nature of labels when they're given reactively, passively, and based on shortcuts and words. But there's also a positive note to it, or an invitation for us to create labels that are used to create labels that are used to create in agreement, and an invitation to create labels that are used to create in agreement and very consciously and future orientated. So, because ultimately, why would we in HR want to engage in activities that replicate the past and that make people feel disengaged, as we could see in this example? So how do we drive engagement and performance through an unlabeled environment? What kind of changes can we make? What can we start? And at this point, I guess you're all interested in figuring that out. And the answer, as you might imagine, is unfortunately not that straightforward, but I will be giving you some food for thought. And the first possible answer, or the first element to start with, is to start by being or becoming very, very, very aware of what is useful and what is not so useful for individuals and organizations. And the quote that you can see here on the screen, all models are wrong, but some are useful, I think is a powerful reminder, essentially meaning that we might have the best personality or the best performance measurement tools in our companies, but unfortunately, they will never ever be fully right or wrong. And George Box was a mathematician, and he even applied that concept to science. So imagine how true things that we're measuring in HR actually are. So the more important question to evaluate here is which of the labeling techniques are helpful for the individuals and for the companies, and kind of essentially measuring that and making sure that we're not just applying labels as a part of an outdated HR process. And so that would be my first tip for you to essentially make an inventory of all of your HR process and evaluate exactly that. Which processes are past-based? Which processes have a reactive character and are one-directional? And how can you turn them into empowering, future-oriented agreements? And I will warn you, starting with systems is not an easy one, as you will probably figure out that all HR systems rely precisely on these three labels that we saw in the beginning. They need to be fed with past-based information, with shortcut-related and one-directional based labels. In my book, you can actually read about some of unlabeled processes, but there's also a kind of different way to approach this, which we'll be exploring now. So processes is one thing, but a far more sustainable way to start changing things, and is essentially to train individuals and also managers to ask the right questions. Questions in line with what we explored that are future orientated, collaborative, and empowering, and help us move away a little bit from those that replicate the past or lead to one-directional judgment calls. And to help you shift into this mindset, I've prepared three cases. And in each case, we will compare how labeled questions can essentially pull us away from creating a thriving, agile, and high-performing environment, and how unlabeled question can move us in exactly that direction. And I will be doing that with one clear objective. So I will be doing that to foster the conditions for more creativity, diversity, collaboration, resilience, and engagement. And I have not randomly picked these items. These are cultural values consistently linked to high performing and agile organizations. And I've pulled the list from multiple studies on what actually drives these thriving workplaces. And I'm sure that probably more than one of you who are listening, working in people and culture, have these high on your agenda, right? If that's the case, I encourage you to just pop the one that is highest on your priority list to the chat, just to see how aligned we are on this one. So let's start with the first mismatch between what we want and what labels do. Essentially, looking at exactly these elements. How can labeled questions move us away from a thriving company, a thriving culture, and how can unlabeled question help us to get there? So the first mismatch is we say we want creativity, but we keep asking questions that react to what we see. So let me explain that a little bit further. The root of the word creativity is creation. The opposite of that, reactivity. So if we genuinely want forward-looking and creative and innovative companies, then simply reacting to what already happened, what we see in the past, is one of the least helpful things we can do in business. And I think that's something that we've already started to internalize in innovation and in the startup sector. So phrases like create from a blank page or think outside of the box are common, and we know that this is like an essential part of business success. But what we talk about and what we think about way less is essentially that the same notion of creativity in the sense of creating doesn't just apply to products or ideas. It starts with how we see ourselves and how we start to see and create others. So essentially, meaning that creativity is about creating who we need who we need to become in order to get where we want to go. From a personal perspective and from a leadership perspective, it also means about helping others become who they need to be in order to move the business forward. So let's start with unlabeling ourselves. What stops us from creating or unlabeling ourselves? Well, it's often the labels we've carried from the past. For example, just to take my personal example, if I had fully believed and reacted to the labels I was given throughout my career, or the ones that I gave, how I labeled myself about being an introvert, not being particularly structured, or not very resilient, I wouldn't probably be giving that keynote today, and I wouldn't have been able to present with pride those three labels that you saw on the opening slide: being an author, a mom, a people development lead. So an unlabeled and a more creative question you could ask yourself, and which essentially also got me to these three labels of being an author, a mom, and a people development lead, was essentially who do I need to become to get there, and then secondly, who can help me get there. So essentially, meaning that the skills and attributes needed to get there was really just something that was a byproduct of the learning process, because it was definitely missing in the beginning. And if I had reacted to these labels, I wouldn't even have started that journey. So let's now look at how we create others. What gets in the way? And I think the case study we show is a very good example for that. It's again labels and labels that make us pose leading questions, such as, have you seen how Anna is never paying attention to details? Have you seen the performance rating of Carl in the system? That essentially not being creation, and that obviously not leading to creativity in the business. That's something really, really reactive. So how can we as leaders, as manager, flip it around? Which kind of questions would we need to ask? So it's essentially creative agreement questions to ask that could be around what's your purpose? Where do you want to be? And how does that connect to our business vision? How can I support you in becoming that person? How can I commit to truly listening for that in everything you say? How can I promote exactly that when speaking about you with others? Is there a chance to create someone by giving them a leap of faith, for example, by inviting them to a table they might not be entirely ready for yet? So, essentially, to sum this mismatch up, creativity is achieved through questions that create, not through judgments that react. Let's go with the second mismatch. Essentially, we say we want collaboration and diversity, but in practice, we often block it by labeling people and creating in and out groups through, again, labels. So, what we actually need, and especially with today's demographic shifts, is more collaboration across age groups, teams, and countries. And I think we all know how essential that is for innovation and long term success. But how do labels get in the way of making that happen? Well, you might have noticed that we spend a lot of time putting people into boxes and generalizing and categorizing them. And so labeled assumption based on key concepts and generalizations could, for example, be everyone in Gen Z is just lazy. Blue colors will resist that change. The marketing team hates that tool. And yes, there might be patterns and sometimes generalizations do help us, but categorizing people like that does create distance. And that is actually one of the main points that hinders collaboration because collaboration really, really depends on empathy. And empathy is something that you can actually train. And empathy is something that essentially drops when we narrow our in group. So essentially through labeling people as different or other, a different generation, a different team, a different seniority group. And empathy grows or gets broader when we broaden our view. So essentially that is done by dropping labels and by seeing people for their shared humanity and seeing them just as we are. So if empathy grows by removing labels, why do we still put on more labels in HR if we want to achieve collaboration? So let's look at some unlabeled questions that actually support collaboration. So something that you can do is ask yourself more often, how is that person in front of me, maybe a different generation, maybe a different team, maybe a different country, just like me? What hopes, challenges, or values do we share? How can we connect from that common ground? And that, by the way, and I've really experienced it personally, if done regularly in very diverse gatherings, drive collaboration and belonging way more than any program or framework ever could. So essentially, to sum that one up, the fewer labels we use, the more empathy we build, and the more empathy, the more collaboration. So let's go with the last mismatch, which is around resilience and engagement, two important cultural values. So we say we want resilience and engagement, but we make happiness dependent on labels and external factors. So what do we actually want to achieve? So essentially, in today's very fast changing and complex world of work, most people and culture teams are trying to build environments that are engaged, resilient, and also able to perform no matter the situation, no matter the stress level, and that ideally without needing constant direction and constant management. But what we often actually do in very labeled HR practices is probably unintentionally sending the opposite message. We teach people that their motivation and happiness depends on external validation, titles, ratings, promotions. We build systems where happiness is conditional and labels are the center of it. It sounds like, for example, you will only get the raise once you hit the target. only after the promotion will we be granted a more interesting project, or only after receiving that recognition will I feel truly valued. The challenge with that, well, it turns happiness and resilience into something that needs a label and that needs an or an HR system or a manager. So it's something really, really, really reactive. How do we unpack that? And an inspiration for that was definitely, and maybe some of you have read it, the book called The Happiness Track, which essentially the main quote in the book being, "Whoever chases happiness, high happiness runs past it." And that's exactly what I meant in the beginning. That it's around like only if I achieve X will I get Y. That is often created through labels in the workplace. So, what could be unlabeling questions to move away from this if-then principle? How would I show up today if I weren't chasing a title but building something meaningful? If resilience came from meaning, not reward, what would we do differently in our company? And lastly, what does it look like to grow through a challenge, not just push through to hit a target or a title? So again, here to sum it up, the more we rely on labels to reward people, the less likely we are to build resilient, engaged, and self-sufficient teams. So as you can see, all we want, all we've ever wanted, and all that we need in today's business world is essentially lying on the other side of labeling. And just a closing thought um, is that I would like to leave you with is the following. So we often question the term human resources, especially the resource part. And yes, I agree. It doesn't really fit how we want to treat and respect people at work. We talk a lot about humanizing the workplace, making people feel more important, and that's obviously a very, very, very important message. But what the word human also reminds of us of is something else, and something that we saw in the first part of the presentation. The fact that we as humans, uh, essentially, our brains are wired to label. They're wired to label, to judge, and to sort. That is really survival, and that is really how our brains operate. That's also how we make sense of the world. But still, what if we could judge just a little bit less? And so, what if we focus less on being human in the judging sense and more on just being? So, being present, being curious, being open to how someone is right now, not how we met them in the past. And maybe that is where the real shift begins. Thank you for your attention. And I will be looking in the Q&A just to see if we have questions coming in. Sorry, what is the name of the book you mentioned? The Happiness Trap. The Happiness Trap. Any other questions? Doesn't seem we have a lot of questions. If not, I would say thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope you have a nice rest of the day. See you soon. Bye.